és meg is adnám a szót Christopher Collins úrnak, aki a Cambridge-i Egyetem Margaret Thatcher alapítványának az elnöke. Mr. Collins, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to visit Budapest. I never need much urging when people say, would you like to come? A beautiful city. Thank you too to the Századvég Foundation, new friends, old friends, also the Danube Institute and the Hungarian Review, and for the hospitality of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, this beautiful building. The theme of our conference today is Thatcherite Principles of Governance, the strong nation state, moral conviction and iron will. Certainly Margaret Thatcher possessed both those personal qualities. I can testify that from having worked closely with her for 4 years when she was writing her memoirs. And John O'Sullivan, sitting there, knew her even better, and I'm sure had exactly the same experience. In private, she was actually a very motherly person, a very nice person to work for, very kind, very gentle, quite belying in some ways the image of the Iron Lady. She would often touch me on the arm and say, "Chris, are you getting enough to eat?" She was always worried about my not eating enough. Food, however, was never lacking. I never remember feeling hungry when she was around. But since she worked every minute that God gave, the thing that was in short supply was sleep. That was the thing that I can remember having missed. Now, what I'm going to do is to attempt to give some life to the themes of this conference by talking about Margaret Thatcher's policies in Hungary. Of course, I know it's going to be of particular interest to people here, but I think actually it fits the themes of the conference particularly well. There's something very interesting about what happened in Hungary and very important. I'm going to concentrate on the period up to 1984, when she made her famous visit here, which some of you I think will remember. It's the period in which the archives are open for study, and I want to make a small plug, an advert for my foundation, if I may. We publish her archives online. We're attempting to put every document that she saw as Prime Minister on the internet. It's an initiative no one has ever attempted before. There are times I wake in the middle of the night thinking this is completely crazy, there's too much of it, billions upon billions of pages. And we have files from many countries in the world, including some from Hungary, from the archive that we can almost see out of the window over there, the National Archive. We've really scoured the world looking for things that are relevant. So please do visit the Margaret Thatcher website. You will find material on Hungary right there. The archives matter for another reason, I think. Margaret Thatcher was a politician of ideas in many respects. It is always worth listening, thinking about the ideas that she was offering. But there's a paradox. She was not interested at all in ideas for their own sake. She was not an intellectual. She was not an academic. She was not interested in study in that way. She saw ideas in a very practical sense as tools, even sometimes as weapons, methods for moving the world. So her interest in them has to be understood in relation to what she actually did. And what I'm going to try, therefore, today is explain her practice as well as her thinking. Link the two up, because those two really only make sense if they're seen together. Another point to make is that the ideas were never window dressing. Sometimes politicians will come out with something that is very different from what they do in private. With her, that was never the case. On the contrary, the private extended the public, and that becomes very apparent when you look at it. Now, Margaret Thatcher came to office knowing little or nothing of Hungary. There's a story told by a former British ambassador to Hungary, a predecessor of Mr. Lindsay, which he perhaps will know. This ambassador had worked for her at Number 10, and when he left her employment, she offered him a sort of reward. He said, "What job would you like, Brian?" And he came to her and said, "I'd like to be ambassador to Hungary." And she said, "Oh, Brian, how boring. Hungary, why do you want to go there?" Now, Margaret Thatcher was wrong. Hungary isn't boring. There's no sense in which it's a boring place to go. And I don't think she actually really meant that Hungary was boring. What was boring was the kind of paperwork about Hungary that passed across her office desk. Because in those days, British commentary, British analysis of Hungary was based on Kremlinology, the study of what the Communist Party was doing from little bits of evidence that amounted to very little. And the criminologists really knew very little, but unfortunately, they made up for it by writing at great length. And as everybody will tell you, prime ministerial patience and time are always commodities in short supply. I'm sure true now as then. So she was expressing some frustration rather than disinterest in Hungary, I think. Now, the essence of her view when she became Prime Minister was very simple. The regime in Hungary was a little better than many in Eastern Europe, but sadly that was to say very little really. It had achieved a small freedom of manoeuvre in economic policy, but none meaningfully in foreign policy. She had no illusions whatever about it. She knew full well the bloody beginnings of Kardar's career also. And yet, in line with my theme of practicality, she would do business with Kardar. She would shake his hand, try to develop a relationship, but do so without glossing over the past. She would never let the past slip away, as we shall see. She started also from the view that there was an important axiom of Western policy, that we should differentiate our approach between the states of Eastern Europe. We should reward states that demonstrated even the smallest movement from the Soviet line. In fact, we talked up such deviations, perhaps knowing them to be insubstantial, but seeing some propaganda value in doing that, and hoping over time that we will begin to bring into being a difference between these states. In practice, this meant in fact that we extended Western credit on more generous terms to those states. And that played a large part in Hungary's ability in that period to sustain living standards higher than much of the rest of the Soviet bloc. So that was the situation when she came to office. But the Polish crisis of 1980-81, culminating in martial law in December 81, threw all this up in the air. It was a huge crisis which tested Western policy profoundly. The records now show a hidden story about Hungary, which I shall tell you first. The Reagan administration introduced sanctions against the Polish and the Soviet governments, creating a wide divide in the West. Ronald Reagan privately was scornful of other Western leaders. I don't think necessarily Margaret Thatcher, but many of the other leaders in Europe. He called them cowardly. He called them, in the American phrase, chicken littles, who feared that the sky would fall if they did anything against the Soviet Union. But there still was certainly tension between Thatcher and Reagan at this point. She was very opposed particularly to US sanctions over the Siberian gas pipeline, a large project that was intended to create trade links really between East and West and give hard currency to the Soviets. Much of the purpose of those American sanctions on the pipeline was to stop this hard currency going east. As Poland collapsed, the Soviet Union became desperate for cash to sustain its satellite state there, and began withdrawing deposits from Hungarian banks on such a scale that in March 1982, the Bank of England sent an urgent message to number 10 Downing Street saying basically that the Hungarian banks were broke. The end was coming very rapidly for Hungary. And the Hungarian Central Bank was very quickly on the line too to the Bank of England and other friends in Europe. We get the beginnings of a familiar story. The central bank has put together a rescue package. They're trying to use official money to keep the commercial banks, who have much more at stake, from running to the exit. Hungary was at this stage of the last phase of its long application to join the IMF. So the plan was, let's create a kind of lifeboat to keep Hungary afloat until it gets into harbour. And this is where the politics comes in, that is to be very interesting. There were many people in the United States government, particularly Caspar Weinberger, the Defense Secretary, and his deputy, Richard Pearl, who said, look, what are we doing rescuing Hungary? Should we be doing this? The reason Hungary is in difficulties is the Soviets are looking for cash. They're looking for cash because we're making it difficult for them. We're deliberately choking off their sources of finance. Why on earth should we make it easier at the same time as we're making it difficult? Actually, let them rescue Hungary, if they can. Or maybe they can't, or won't, they don't want to. Either way, this sends a very useful message, that they're no longer really in control, that they are not the power that people think. And this contradicts much of her thinking, and that also of the State Department. So there's a tussle going on in the US administration, and easily the Pentagon could have killed the whole rescue scheme with a single speech, say, casting doubt on whether the IMF would actually accept Hungary as a member. It was a very fraught situation. The US Federal Reserve refused to join the operation too. They stood back. So the Bank of England and the Bundesbank were the lead players. Now there was logic, of course, in Weinberger's position, but Margaret Thatcher's response is very interesting. She understood the logic, of course, but while she believed in never shirking a fight, she also believed in choosing your weapons with care. She feared the instability that would come from a default in Hungary and the way that it would spread. We're all now very familiar with the spreading of banking crises. She understood full well that you can start a banking crisis, but can you stop it? You know where it's going to begin, but where will it end? And who lent the money, of course, to Hungary? Western banks. We were the ones ultimately who would pay a price for this policy of forcing the East into default. After much pressure, all of it private, not something that would have been known even by the Hungarian government at the time, Weinberger held off. The US did not torpedo this lifeboat that was rescuing Hungary. And she had therefore intervened in a way that none of you would have known, in this practical way that she had to resolve something that mattered hugely to Hungary, a secret intervention, if you like. Now, in the files of the Bank of England, one last thing about this story. Deep in the vaults of the bank, in fact, so deep that you can hear underground trains going by as you read the documents, there's a little glimpse of Kádár, the Communist Party chief at this time. He was really quite subtle and skilled in his dealings with the West, including with the bankers. He knew how much Hungary needed these central bankers on his side. And the British man reported home from a meeting in the Hungarian parliament addressed by Kádár what he'd said. He ended, he said, by tackling the thesis that the Soviet Union could be attacked through the pressure on Eastern European countries. He said it might be possible to liquidate the Soviet satellites and perhaps Western Europe, but the USSR would remain. Kádár understood full well the inwardness of this particular argument. That's my first story then. The interesting thing about that particular argument over money, over the default in 1982 that didn't happen, is that Margaret Thatcher acted as a bridge between the US and Europe. In public, she never ever aspired to that role and denied that she wanted to play it, but in private, she had no hesitation in playing it when it suited. One even finds her telling the European Council over dinner in March 1982, and I quote, "The US must be brought along to an appreciation of the European view on these issues. The community is much more deeply involved than the US." Iron Lady she certainly was, but she resisted steps against the Soviets and its bloc that threatened to hurt us, and Britain as much if not all. And her reputation for toughness on the Soviets made her all the more effective in bringing home this point to the US administration. Again and again, her reputation for strength actually meant that she had more room for maneuver and flexibility than would otherwise have been the case. That takes me to her visit to Hungary in 1984. After the Falklands War in 1982, she became a much more significant figure internationally. The war had given her prestige at a wholly different level, far higher than she'd ever had before, especially in the United States. The Iron Lady had proved her mettle, as one British MP put it. And characteristically, she saw the opportunity and was ambitious for a bigger international role. Sometimes, I must say, elbowing her foreign minister rather to one side, which caused them a lot of discomfort and eventually her a lot of grief too. Now, how she sought to use that new power is very interesting. She launched a determined effort to ease East-West tension, particularly by opening contacts at the highest level to the East. Such an initiative was improbable from her to such a degree that she had to make speeches expounding it several times before the press would pick it up. They really had to be led along very carefully to understand this was what the Iron Lady was saying. She finally got it across in Washington, where she told an audience full of Reagan administration people, "We have to deal with the Soviet Union, but we must deal with it not as we would like it to be, but as it is. We live on the same planet, and we have to go on sharing it. We stand ready, therefore, if and when the circumstances are right, to talk to the Soviet leadership." This was the period of ailing Soviet leaders. Andropov had succeeded Brezhnev and spent much of his time in hospital. It wasn't merely that he was a KGB man who viewed the West with deepest suspicion. She was receiving secret information from a British agent in the KGB, Oleg Gordievsky, that the Soviets actually feared a first strike from the West. Something she found incredible, but came to believe. She was convinced in the end this was real. The Soviets actually had this fear. And she persuaded Ronald Reagan in deepest secrecy that this was what the Soviets thought too. He was as surprised as she was. It's important, though, at this point to realize they were not seeking a revival of détente. In many ways, her earliest and most enduring commitment and connection with Ronald Reagan arose from their mutual rejection of détente when they were both making their way politically in the 1970s, at a time when such views were very much out of the mainstream. They had had two elements to their critique of détente. One was they saw the West negotiating always from weakness. They believed every single year, every deal, détente had seen the West get a little further down. They were suspicious of that. And they detected an insidious assumption of moral equivalence between the two sides in the era of détente. as if somehow they were great powers playing a game, one against the other, dividing the spoils between them. There was an air perhaps of cynicism, fairly or unfairly, hanging over the diplomacy of Henry Kissinger, a man she admired and liked and got to know quite well, and yet at the same time was somewhat wary of. And I think the Reagan administration too kept their distance from Kissinger. This was an enduring problem with the era of détente, this sense of great power maneuver that was very much against what she and Reagan stood for. They really believed there was something to choose between the two sides. This was not maneuver, this was not dividing the spoils, great powers at game, at play. They were not relativists under the skin. We're back, in fact, to the theme of the conference, moral conviction and iron will. I mean, they both fundamentally believed the West was better than the East, that it had right on its side. By 1983, she thinks it's time to move on, though. We've reached a point where the West is beginning to be in a position of strength, in her view. We've successfully deployed crews and Pershing. Our economies are recovering, and strong anti-Soviet policies across the West are winning re-election for governments, in Britain included, of course. So she's seeing a position in which we can now begin to talk. Suddenly, a visit to Hungary is an idea whose time has come. There'd been a standing invitation to British Prime Ministers to come. For many years, it was almost a ritual. Every time a Hungarian minister came to London or a British minister came here, there'd be the invitation added, and we'd politely say yes sometime. Now, actually, it's going to happen. We send that message. Unfortunately, as is the way in diplomacy, everybody had the same bright idea at the same time, so the Italians and West Germans did exactly the same. So having waited for decades for a Western visitor, you suddenly have three, all prepared to come and jostling for advantage. It's very interesting from the Hungarian archives. I can tell a little story about how the Hungarians handled this. Kádár knew that he would take flack, criticism for this visit. He didn't ask the Russians, actually, whether he could invite Margaret Thatcher, but he did line up support from Willi Stoff, the East German leader. That meant, I think, not inviting Helmut Kohl first. I strongly suspect that part of the deal was invite Thatcher first, and I'll back that when you were criticised, which indeed Kádár was later by the Czechs. So there's a little bit of interest just from the archives over there. Margaret Thatcher probably was a better candidate for a visitor to the Kohl in terms of sheer star power. One of the things about that visit was that it was actually meant to be glitzy, so far as Hungary did glitz in those days. It was meant to be showy, and she was the kind of person who would play this up. Whenever she travelled, clothes were a very big issue. She spent ages planning what she would look like, thinking of the photos, and this was never something that was incidental. I think she rather enjoyed doing it as well. I'm not saying it was a chore, but at the same time she understood the power of impressions. And she was very well advised too. Her press secretary was a man of great skill, Michael Bernardino. So this visit was very much choreographed to look good back home and to show this new initiative opening to the East. Now, in her briefing for the visit, from the British Foreign Office, I must be careful with the ambassador sitting there, it began with the phrase, the Hungarian Revolution took place over 27 years ago. This was a none too subtle hint that it was rather ancient history by 1884. We shouldn't perhaps spend too long talking about the Hungarian Revolution. It's very interesting how she responded to that phrase. She crossed it straight through and wrote instead, such a statement might create the impression that we were seeking to downplay the significance of the event. No way was she going to gloss over what happened in 1956, and I'll carry on a bit later to tell you how she handled the legacy of 1956. Her way of opening to the East was not to downplay differences at all, however tempting diplomatically. If anything, she planned to draw the distinction more firmly. She rejected the language of détente even as she sought rapprochement. The point was to do business across the divide, not to pretend it didn't exist or talk it away. The fact of her visit undoubtedly mattered more than anything that was done during the days. It was memorable all the same. Some of you, I think, will remember the TV pictures of her visit to the covered market in Budapest, where she bought honey, garlic, and paprika. There was a little pantomime at the end when the storeholder tried to give her these things. And she said, no, I must pay. And the ambassador produced a brown envelope full of notes which she had no idea what they were worth, and just gave her. But a good housewife always pays for her groceries. And of course the press just loved that. She was always keen on the pantomime, as I said. Then she was due to see Kádár. At the last minute, there was a classic piece of communist manoeuvre. Officials rushed in saying it was very sad, but she would not be able to see him. Unfortunately, she'd come a long way. They understood. She'd seen the Prime Minister already, she'd seen the President. Sadly, she wouldn't be able to see the leader. There was an explosion. She was extremely annoyed. No way would they do this to her. And in fact, of course, Kara then changed his mind and turned up minutes later. His first thing was to ask politely permission to smoke, which it seems was given. They had the usual kind of chat. There was no meeting of minds, but at the same time, they were clearly out to do business. From the very beginning, she was very happy to try to reach some sort of understanding of what kind of man he was. And this is how she handled 1956. The Foreign Office said, well, perhaps we don't need to really talk too much about that. What she did when she met Kara was say, what happened to Imre Nagy then? You can imagine the note taker sort of shrinking in the seat. And what Kara said was, well, oh, the Soviets made me do it. You know, it's a shame. But she made her point. She always did this, actually. Whenever there was a difficult subject, she would wait for the one-to-one meeting, and then she would drop it. She did it with Gorbachev. She did it also with P.W. Berta, speaking about Mandela. She would never hesitate to raise the difficult thing face-to-face and look you in the eye and see what your response was. Quite powerful technique. Now, her trip to Budapest was a kind of road test for this new post-détente approach. It worked pretty well, despite the reference to Nagy. The Hungarians came out of it ahead, in our view. And diplomacy has to give something to both sides, even if you don't like the other side very much on this occasion. On the British side, it worked extremely well to make her point that she was moving on from the previous phase of the Cold War. She noticed, too, that Budapest put on a pretty good show. And a couple of years later, of course, she went to Moscow. And the fur hat she wore in Budapest came out again, and the pictures then were equally great. Communist pomp, it turned out, was not bad. You could make a good thing from it. Let me close a little bit with 1956. Britain had its own crisis in 56. We had the Suez crisis. And it cast a long shadow for us too. It was a potent emblem of decline, Britain's inability to reverse the nationalising of the Suez Canal. Many believed, in fact, that what happened in Hungary that year owed something to the West's distraction and division over the Suez crisis. And curiously, it fell to Margaret Thatcher to move Britain beyond the Suez crisis, because the Falklands War in many ways settled this sense of Britain as endlessly on the back foot, militarily, politically, foreign policy terms. She actually, without intending it, turned out to be the politician who, more than anything else, liquidated the legacy of 56 in Britain. Now, of course, the wound inflicted on Hungary in 1956 was rather greater. And who would have guessed that in 5 years from 1984, so much would have changed, and Kara would be out of power, and Imre Nagy would be reburied in state. But Margaret Thatcher's visit to Hungary bore fruit a lot sooner than that. There was a new British emphasis on Eastern Europe, which she pressed powerfully on our allies. There were further trips east, there was deeper engagement. And as the ambassador mentioned, there was a famous speech in Bruges in September 1988, remembered as a founding event of Euroscepticism in Britain, but which contained a passage that he quoted, reminding Europe, the European community that was, that it wasn't a monopolist owning the whole of the European identity, that there was a Europe to the east that we should never forget. This was not a tactical maneuver, something designed to win a point in a battle with the European community. It was a deep expression of her view of Europe and of the Cold War. She always did whatever she could to ensure that Britain and its allies did not fall into thinking of the East-West divide, or even talking of the East-West divide as something you had to live with, a permanent, if regrettable, fact of life. Never, ever would she do that. I could quote what the ambassador did, and I should just end, in fact, with the final line of her remarks from the Bruges speech. She said, "We should always look on Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest as great European cities. I don't think it's an accident that Budapest was last in that list. I think she had a special affection here, arising from her visit, as I have from my visits too. So, thank you."